During this year's celebration of Women's History Month, Queens Public Library is celebrating the leadership, strength, and solidarity of women identifying individuals in all walks of life. Be inspired to unleash your power within and make your visions for the future a reality. For upcoming programs, book recommendations, and more, visit queenslib.org/WHM 2023. Tax season is here. Queens Public Library is partnering with a number of organizations to offer free in-person tax counseling sessions at several QPL locations. Visit our blog at queenslibrary.org for more information. QPL's mobile app now translates to over 90 languages. Check out all the services you can access using our mobile app and its latest features. It's available for both Apple iOS and Android. Download the QPL mobile app today at connect.queenslibrary.org.
Welcome to Wellness Wednesdays. I'm Christopher Gallardesa, Queens Public Library's Community Health Educator. Today, we welcome back Cherise Francis for our monthly workshop series, where we will read and discuss excerpts from essays and generate written work based on prompts inspired by the memoir anthology, You Are Your Best Thing: Vulnerability, Shame, Resilience, and the Black Experience, edited by Tarana Burke and Brene Brown. Based on the quotation from Toni Morrison's beloved, how can we see ourselves as our own best thing? How does living in our truth give us the breathing room to be our full selves? We will be deep diving into various themes like vulnerability, family, healing, spirituality, social and institutional oppressions, art, and memory. And without further ado, I welcome Cherise Francis. And Cherise, please take it away.
Thank you, Christopher. And welcome back, everyone, to the You Are Your Best Thing series. Today, we'll be reading from Duran Youngs, who's the founder of Black Therapist Rock. We'll be reading her essay, Honoring Our Stories, Transforming Our Pain. Before we get started, I wanted to share a few quotes that is reflective of the work we'll be looking at today around pain and grief and doing grief work. So the first quote is from Zora Neale Hurston, in which she says, "If you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it." And I think this quote is important because of the importance of speaking up about our pain and our grief and our grievances, because as they say, history is often written by the winners, and sometimes those winners cause harm to other people. And so if those who are harmed don't speak up, then it will seem like nothing is wrong. And speaking up about injustices is how change is actually made. And this I got from Black Liturgy's Instagram, who we'll talk about later in the resources. Next quote I wanted to bring in was from Malcolm X, and he said, "If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that the blow made. And they haven't even pulled the knife out, much less heal the wound. They won't even admit the knife is there." And oftentimes, I think this quote is important because oftentimes, especially in this country, we think healing the wound of racism and other types of oppression means to just simply don't talk about it. But that's not how wounds are healed. Wounds are healed by actually addressing the problem and taking steps necessary to actually rectify the situation. And then this last quote from James Baldwin, once again, thinking about the idea of what progress and healing actually means. What is it you want me to reconcile myself to? I was born here almost 60 years ago. I'm not going to live another 60 years. You always told me it takes time. It has taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brothers and sisters' time, my nieces and my nephews' time. How much time do you want for your progress? And I wanted to include this quote as well in thinking about healing, that waiting for the wounds of pain and grief to just fester makes the situation worse. Handling the wound immediately, handling the emergencies and crises that we're currently dealing with now helps for us to have a better future, not waiting till later. So now I'm thinking about those 3 quotes. I want us to get started on reading Duran Young's essay, Honoring Our Stories, Transforming Our Pain. We don't talk enough about racial trauma in this country. In fact, even as a therapist and facilitator, I found myself stunned one fateful day when my son came home from kindergarten crying. When I asked what happened, he replied, "I wish I was white like everybody else." I froze. I didn't know what to say or do. I thought to myself, when did this happen? How did this happen? What did I miss? I spun into a shame guilt spiral. I'm the founder of Black Therapist Rock, for goodness sake. I've really messed up somewhere along the way if my own kid wants to be white. My son further explained that during recess, one of his white friends didn't want to play with them and said, "Brown kids aren't as fun as playing with other kids." A few hours later, after recovering from the shock of this statement, I hid in a corner to wipe my own tears and slowly regained my parental bearings. I realized that what mattered most was that he was able to give words to his sadness. Even at his young age, he was able to do something that I struggle to do as an adult. He spoke truth to power. The last thing he needed was for me to be overwhelmed with shame or guilt. What he did need was for me to be with him in this familiar yet overwhelming pain so that he didn't have to carry it alone. I needed to not only reaffirm his inherent worth and value, but also validate that he had experienced what he had experienced was racism, and that it was not just in his head. It was real, and so was the emotional impact. I'm glad that my son trusted me with his pain and felt connected enough to share his experience. The very definition of trauma is that we are in it alone. We the very definition of trauma is that we are in it alone with little or no emotional support to make meaning of critical life altering experiences. Together, we did some deep breathing and grounding, and I realized that he had activated the little girl in me who probably experienced a similar feeling but had to hide it. Growing up in Wichita Falls, Texas, where the KKK held quarterly rallies and publicly burned crosses as a form of visual intimidation, I had learned to cope through silence. My mother was extremely pro Black, but definitely not anti white. She was more pro people. She talked about historic Black leaders constantly. I believe this may have been the saving grace of my race socialization. However, because we were surrounded by violence and chaos in the projects, on top of her personal struggles with drug addiction and untreated mental illness, I felt she didn't have time to be bothered with my little feelings and questions about my environment. So I did what most of us do. I learned to numb my feelings so that I could work twice as hard to make something for myself. Working twice as hard leaves us chronically exhausted and emotionally unavailable to ourselves or anyone else. We then raise children who feel emotionally neglected. As a mother, I acknowledge the emotional weight of parenting Black children. I imagine it's the same psychological burden our enslaved ancestors carried. Racial trauma is the psychological result of having to navigate white supremacy in a body that is made to feel inferior. It makes us feel trapped in our own skin. It makes us feel as though we are suffocating and choking on hundreds of daily messages filled with shame. This includes humiliating events at work, having to have the talk with our teenagers about driving while Black, and the vicarious trauma of witnessing public murders of Black and Brown bodies. Collectively, we armor up to function in the environment, leaving the trauma misunderstood and misdiagnosed. This protective armor creates steel cages around our hearts and significantly reduces our capacity for healthy connections both inside and out. We can't live a wholehearted life without connection. Experiencing love, joy, belonging requires us to be with our feelings. We can't heal if we continue to pretend we aren't hurting. Hurt people hurt people. In America, because of our history, we are all hurting. As a country, the story we collectively make up is that feelings and people don't matter. We turn to this story because believing it is easier than the risk of feeling and connecting. When we don't have healthy connections, we learn how to navigate the world in isolation, which isn't really living, just merely functioning. Sometimes I talk about vulnerable things, but don't allow myself to feel vulnerable. If it's not connecting to me, more of who I am, if it's not coming from this deep, vulnerable place in my heart, is it really connection? If it's coming from my head or if I have an agenda behind it, is it really connecting? Certified Daring Way facilitator Dr. LaDonna Butler states, vulnerability, the state of showing up unarmored, shaking, yet willing to embrace the benefit and consequence of human relationship, sometimes feels counterintuitive as a Black person. Our collective internal protection mechanisms are transmitted strategies of survival that we inherited from our ancestors. However, vulnerability in the face of racial trauma challenges the operating systems of oppression. It illuminates the sheer power of our presence, the truth of our existence as equitable partners in humanity. When I'm being vulnerable with myself about all of my life experiences, I remember why I had to armor up in the first place. By honoring my pain, I can take inventory and decide which of these methods of protection I need in this moment and which I can leave behind. I have more choices and more liberation around how I show up with other people. Racism threatens our ability to set healthy boundaries by silencing us and calling our experiences and realities into question. This is especially true when you grow up in poverty or when there are multiple layers of oppression like homophobia, transphobia, fatphobia, ableism, sexism, classism, Islamophobia, or xenophobia. The layers of otherness smother and silence our voices. Through this silence, other forms of trauma go unchecked and unspoken, including multiple forms of abuse. So we'll stop there and return. But I want to talk a little bit about pain, grief, and storytelling. As Duran Young says, a lot of oppression forces us to be silent. And so our power can come through speaking up about the ways in which we're harmed and feel pain. And I wanted to give a definition of pain and grief. Pain and grief are signs and expressions in response to hurt, distress, and significant loss. And I wanted to use this quote from Ancestors in Training. And they said, grief work includes holding space for the stories that could not be or were not told while making room for new griots to arrive. So, in doing the work around grief and pain and healing wounds around pain and grief, and acknowledging all the losses and ways that we've been hurt, we end up making room for other possibilities of life to grow from there, as Ancestors in Training said. And this is from an article by Shirley Jean Schmidt called Honoring Pain, a Loving Solution to Chronic Suffering. And this was an article around people who are disabled, who have, chronic pain issues, but I think it relates to, chronic grief, which, Black people and other marginalized groups often have to go through in society. We live in a culture that teaches us that pain is bad and therefore synonymous with suffering. To reduce this suffering, we take pills, distract ourselves, use mental tricks to block our awareness of pain, and or try to relax our pain away. We usually condemn our pain but rarely honor it with loving kindness. The fact is, pain experienced skillfully with heightened awareness can significantly reduce our sense of suffering. In many cases, it is simply our negative relationship with our pain that makes it a problem. There are a variety of easy to learn mindfulness meditation techniques that can help us greatly improve our relationship with pain. Most chronic pain patients who use these techniques report significantly lower levels of both pain and suffering. Others report that even when pain levels remain high, their level of suffering can be low. And this goes back to Duran's essay, in which how she talked about dealing with her son's sadness and pain around being discriminated against, how she did breathing exercises and meditative techniques and honored his pain with kindness, and how in doing so that helps him deal with the pain of that moment. And these next two quotes are from the Grieving While Black book by Brisha Wade, um, which is one of the resources I want to bring up for grief work. And this one was a quote from Zenju Earthlyn Manuel, who's the author of The Deepest Peace and the Way of Tenderness. As Black people, one of our widest gateways to freedom is our very own grief. In the way many Black women have stood as protectors and have held out their hands, Wade stands at this gateway, arms open, inviting us into a meadow where we can take our time, acknowledge our loss, and allow our grief to lead us into wellness. Take your time and sip on this one. I thought that was a beautiful blurb for the book. And this is one of the quotes from the book. Until we address the root of what drives people across histories and time to repeat narratives of harm against others, we will continue to merely scratch the surface of spiritual healing. And this reminds me of what Duran says in the essay about hurt people, that these cycles of harm continue when we don't address the root causes of why we harm other people. So, in thinking about that, I want us to go to our first prompt. What is pain or grief? What is a pain or grief that you need to acknowledge and care for? What factors kept you from dealing with your pain or grief? What did you need or do you need now to help you face your pain and grief? And below we see the 7 stages of grief, and you can read that on your own, and I'll give you the next few minutes to begin reflecting and writing in response to the questions. Okay, I hope you were able to write some response to the prompt questions. And let us continue with Duran's essay. In recent years, I've learned what it means to go inside, and I realized why a part of me felt that it was dangerous, overwhelming, and inconceivable because of my childhood sexual abuse. Sexual abuse robs us from connection to ourselves, especially to our bodies. When we become disconnected from our bodies, it impacts us throughout life. When we live in households filled with shame, there are secrets we hold, and we are taught to ignore whatever it is we think we need, especially when we need help. Living in a Black body, asking for help is one of the most vulnerable things we can do. Code switching, which I learned to do very early in my life, is a survival strategy that requires you to push away parts of who you are and overfunction in other parts. We create all these roles to try to control the impact of racism, to tame it and change ourselves, trying to get on the good side of racism by being the model Black person. There are so many things that we do to shape our lives around these internal messages of you're not good enough and you're unworthy. Carrying the burden of silence, racial trauma, and shame is exhausting and soul crushing. Shame resilience, according to Brene Brown, is the ability to practice authenticity when we experience shame, to move through the experience without sacrificing our values, to come out on the other side of the shame experience with more courage, compassion, and connection than we had going into it. We can affirm ourselves once we realize that we are inherently worthy of basic human rights, and we begin to understand that the system is sick, not us. Critical awareness and the intentional refusal to internalize oppressive messages are necessary to develop shame resilience. In my work, I found that it is very common for Black people to think that discussing emotion is selfish and a waste of time. Why? Because it is not going to change my reality. It's not going to put food on the table. It's not going to help me survive. A lot of times we think, I'm feeling sorry for myself, and where's that going to get me? I'm just going to feel more victimized if I allow myself to feel these things. That is the fear that the emotion will take over or overwhelm us, that we will lose emotional control. That's a very real fear when you still have to wake up in the morning and pretend you're not depressed, worried, or outraged. We think we're going to get stuck and drown in it, and we're going to be overwhelmed by it. Who has time for that? Ain't nobody got time for that. When I advise someone to go to therapy or talk about feelings or even just journal, my recommendations are often disregarded because I'm retired military and have all the privilege and economic access that comes with being middle class. I understand that many people feel they are too busy working to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads and trying not to get shot by the cops. They often feel most of their time is focused on trying to survive, and there will never be any time available for them to be vulnerable. However, that scarcity is a mindset that there will never be enough. It goes beyond our present experience and projects forward to wreak havoc on our future long before it arrives. Anytime you hear the word should, never, can't, or always, look for raw materials of scarcity, shame, comparison, and disengagement. External constraints are very real for the 8.1 million Black Americans living in poverty. Even among the middle class, some are just a few paychecks away from being homeless. Because of the very real poverty brought on by generations of systematic racism, many of us are brought up to believe that vulnerability is a costly privilege that we simply cannot afford to give ourselves or our loved ones. So we hide behind our shame shields, attempting to protect ourselves and one another. A life filled with fear and hypervigilance makes it difficult to trust anyone, including ourselves. A lot of us don't trust our family, our parents, or other Black people. We have been taught that Black is bad or wrong, and we often carry this self-limiting, unconscious belief about ourselves and one another. Shadon McCants, another certified facilitator in the Daring Way, explains it as a legacy burden that makes it hard to kumbaya in a world that hates me for the color of my skin, the texture of my hair, the bass in my voice, and the will to want to live the American dream. In white supremacy culture, it's a dog eat dog world, and everybody is fighting for as much privilege as they can possibly get. Vulnerability is seen as weak and for suckers. Acknowledging the impact of racism on your life is like walking into a big, dark, murky cave. You know that once you go in there, you're not going to be able to see, you're not going to know where you're going or what you'll find, but you walk in anyway because you know there are things in the cave that you need to reclaim, things that have been taken from you. You walk in despite the fear to reclaim your ability to speak up and say what you need, to be seen and heard, and to take up space. As a Black woman, it feels like an act of resistance to have an intentional life, to say that my life is going to be meaningful, to live out the mantra of Black Lives Matter. Living in a constant fear that your life could end at any moment, your future orientation is cut short, and the capacity for hope is often reduced. I have great compassion for the parts of me that didn't want to hope or dream because they carried a deep fear of disappointment. I had to admit that deep down inside, I've been carrying years of anger and despair. Patriarchy has created a culture in which men aren't allowed to feel and women are often punished for doing so publicly. Avoiding emotions has resulted in abuse of power in many forms and at many levels. In our facilitation training, we talked about how it's very difficult to ask people to set down their armor and be vulnerable when racism and white supremacy demands armor. We talk about how this is especially true for Black men. I've been pondering this statement and I've been asking Black men what they need for their healing. Here is what Ty Kuttner, a men's personal development coach, shared. I can't name a lonelier, less cared for, more feared group in America than Black men. The stereotype promoted in the media for hundreds of years has been that the Black man is dangerous. Is it possible to build a relationship with someone you consciously or unconsciously fear? Black men even fear each other, reducing the chances of emotional connection, trust, social support, or community. We live in a country that's hostile towards us, increasing our loneliness. We don't feel valued when we can't provide for our families, and since our ability to provide is limited, we often carry a sense of low self-worth. Most of us are extremely lonely. Who can Black men truly be vulnerable with? I think the answer for all of us is that we have to start by owning our pain and being deeply vulnerable with ourselves first. We must each uncover our own inner wisdom. This is what the Sankofa means to me. Sankofa is a word from the Twi language of Ghana that translates as go back and get it. The Sankofa is a metaphorical symbol used by the Akan people of Ghana, generally pictured as a bird with its head turned backwards, taking an egg from its back. It expresses the importance of reaching back to knowledge learned in the past and bringing it to the present to make positive progress. I believe we should all honor and be amazed by our own stories and the connected heritage of all those who came before us. I'm amazed that all my ancestors survived long enough for me to simply exist in the world. The struggle and hope that allowed me to be here means that my life has meaning and it matters. Maya Angelou said it best. I believe we feel safest when we go inside ourselves and find a home, a place where we belong, and maybe the only place we really do. This is where our vulnerability starts, in the home inside of us. During my childhood, I experienced frequent relocations and long periods of homelessness. I didn't have the sense of home that I'm having to create as an adult. As descendants of people who were stolen from their homeland, we often have difficulty finding our way back home. In 2009, I made my first of many trips to Ghana, West Africa. Something inside me healed when I walked through the door of return, a moment that acknowledges the destruction of the transatlantic slave trade. Living in Ghana for 6 months the following year was the first time in my life that I experienced a deep feeling of community support and consistent joy. I was home, physically and emotionally. I believe that corrective experiences and relational connections outline the path of healing. When I went into slave dungeons in Ghana, I remember putting my hand on the walls and purposely, intentionally wanting to bear witness to the suffering of our ancestors. This deep-seated pain that we collectively still carry in our DNA is rarely acknowledged and has yet to be accounted for and repaired. For me, reparations would be fully funding our healing. When I came back to the United States, I knew that I wanted to help more Black people experience joy and pride around Blackness in the midst of white supremacist culture. I created the nonprofit Black Therapist Rock 6 years later to start to create community and connection among Black healers who often are dealing with their own racial trauma as well as professional isolation. One of my favorite quotes is an African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. You must come together to heal. Our village is counting on it. So that's the end of Duran Young's essay. So, in honoring our pain and grief, I wanted to provide some ways in which different people who deal with pain in various ways, whether it's physical pain, emotional pain, social pain, and various techniques that can be used to deal with pain and grief. So, this was from the previous article that I mentioned earlier about people who have chronic physical pain. And Shirley mentioned a few ways about thinking about how to deal with pain. She mentioned thinking of pain as a small injured child. And I think that's interesting in relation to Duran Young's essay, in which her own son was hurt from discrimination, and how she decided to be tender and kind with him in response to his sadness. Especially him being a little Black boy, and how she just mentioned how Black boys and Black men are often treated in a way that is not kind and is not tender. The next one, honoring the pain with loving kindness, as I mentioned already, about treating with tenderness and kindness and softness. And in our society, softness is often seen as something weak, but actually, softness can be a form of strength as well, a form of care. Letting go of resistance and moving with pain, similar to how Duran talked about how she wanted to connect with her ancestors in her trip to Ghana, and in dealing with their pain as a part of her, and in a sense moving with the pain by trying to connect with it. And also pain as music and dance. And I think of this in relation to how often in Black cultures we use music and dance as a way to help us heal through a lot of the pain of racial trauma. Also, in thinking about honoring pain and grief, I wanted to talk about coping mechanisms versus defense mechanisms. And this is from Good Therapy. How are coping mechanisms and defense mechanisms different? Some may confuse defense mechanisms with coping mechanisms. Although these two concepts share some similarities, they are in fact different. Defense mechanisms mostly occur at an unconscious level, and people are generally unaware they are using them. One's use of coping mechanisms, on the other hand, is typically conscious and purposeful. As Duran said, moving with intention and being purposeful about your life. Coping mechanisms are used to manage an external situation that is creating problems for an individual. Defense mechanisms can change a person's internal psychological state. So, more on coping styles. Coping styles can be problem focused, also called instrumental or emotion focus. Problem focused coping strategies are typically associated with methods of dealing with the problem in order to reduce stress, while emotion focused mechanisms can help people handle any feelings of distress that result from the problem. Further, coping mechanisms can be broadly categorized as active or avoidant. And you can think of avoidant as like setting boundaries for yourself, for example. Active coping mechanisms usually involve an awareness of the stressor and conscious attempts to reduce stress. Avoiding coping mechanisms, on the other hand, are characterized by ignoring or otherwise avoiding the problem. Some coping methods, though they work for a time, are not effective for a long term period. These ineffective coping mechanisms, which can be often counterproductive or have unintended negative consequences, are known as maladaptive coping. Adaptive coping mechanisms are those generally considered to be healthy and effective ways of managing stressful situations. So I also included what some examples of defense mechanisms and maladaptive coping mechanisms are, and some that I've mentioned in previous workshops: masking, posturing, shaming is an example of a maladaptive coping mechanism, unhealthy self medicating or self soothing, so taking drugs and addictions to drugs, social avoidance, so isolating oneself, unhealthy isolation, compulsive behaviors, unnecessary risk taking, and self harm. And here are some healthy types of coping mechanisms. Uh, the most common ones are finding support. Talking about a stressful event with a supportive person can be an effective way to manage stress. Seeking external support instead of self isolating and internalizing the effects of stress can greatly reduce the negative effects of a difficult situation. Much in the same way that Duran had the conversation with her son about the racism that he experienced. Relaxation is the next one. Any number of relaxing activities can help people cope with stress. Relaxing activities may include practicing meditation, progressive muscle relaxation, or other calming techniques, sitting in nature, or listening to soft music. And the other example I gave was breath work, and much in the way that Duran did with her son. Problem solving. This coping mechanism involves identifying a problem that's causing stress and developing and putting into action some potential solutions for effectively managing it. So, with all kinds of problem solving, you have to at first acknowledge the problem as well, which is what Duran talked about in her essay. And last, humor. So, making light of a stressful situation may help maintain perspective and prevent the situation from becoming overwhelming. So, as they always say, laughter is a form of medicine, and also learning to not take oneself so seriously can help you see a situation more clearly instead of overreacting in ways that you don't need to. And last, physical activity. Exercise can serve as a natural and healthy form of stress relief. Running, yoga, swimming, walking, dance, team sports, and many other types of physical activity can help cope with stress and the after effects of traumatic events. And as I mentioned, dance is often an important part of Black cultures in helping us dealing with the trauma of society. So this is another article that centers around grief work, embodiment, and social justice. This is from the blog Refuge in Grief, and they were talking about the work of Layla Saad, who does a lot of work around grief work, somatics, and social justice. And in this article, she talks about grief work is a social justice work. There can be no lasting social justice without discussions of how we come to pain in ourselves, in each other, and in the wider world. I have lots to say on this topic, but today I want to read this piece by Layla Saad. Here's a very short expert highlighting the need to be present with your own grief and anger in order to hear and allow the grief and anger of others. If you cannot stand in the truth of your own experience, you cannot allow others to stand in theirs. The way to make the world safer, more equitable, and more just for all beings includes making space for the reality of pain. And this is from Layla Saad. To the extent that we are unable to tolerate and embrace these dark aspects, we similarly be unable to do the work of sacred activism. If you cannot be with your own rage, then you cannot be with the rage that arises when a POC is getting frustrated with you because of your white privileged behavior. If you cannot be with your own grief, then you cannot be with the grief that POC feels as a result of living with the constant trauma of being oppressed and discriminated against. If you cannot be with your own power, then you cannot make space for POC exerting their power through their voice, their boundary setting, and their no bullshit truth telling. If you truly want to do this work, then saying yes to all the above is a non negotiable. Grief work is social justice work. How we come to pain matters in ourselves and in the wider world. And this reminds me of a quote from James Baldwin, in which he talked about how, in honoring his own pain and his own emotions and wounds, he was able to greater connect with the emotions and griefs of other people through the world in which he traveled, through the books in which he read, by acknowledging his own pain. And this is another article uh, from Alexis Blue called Understanding Black Grief. And this article is important because oftentimes when we talk about pain and grief, it tends to be very individualized. But when it comes to Black grief, it's important to talk about um, to have discussions around collective grief. That grief isn't just something we experience by ourselves, but we also experience within larger communities as well. So I'll read from it. To understand the unique experience of Black loss, grief, and bereavement, it's necessary to consider the collective grief Black Americans have suffered as a result of America's long history of racialization and racist violence. The average lifespan for Black Americans is 78 years, 6 years shorter than it is for white Americans. Compared with white Americans, Black Americans are twice as likely to die of heart disease, 50% more likely to have high blood pressure, and are likelier to die at earlier ages of all causes. Health disparities in the Black community are well documented, but what's less understood is the emotional toll those dire statistics have on Black Americans, who may be losing loved ones more frequently and at younger ages. With Black Americans leading shorter and sicker lives, it's likely they are also experiencing grief more often and earlier in life, making bereavement a healthy disparity of its own, suggests new University of Arizona research published in Frontiers in Psychiatry. And that grief may be accomplished by additional physical and mental health challenges. In the short term, grief can be associated with increased inflammation, high blood pressure, and lowered immunity. In the long term, it may contribute to cardiovascular problems, difficulty sleeping, and unhealthy coping mechanisms. And so you can see how the unacknowledgement of grief and pain can lead to a lot of health issues and can affect your health and well-being. So this was a paper that from Wilson and O'Connor, and they wanted to understand the unique experience of Black loss, grief, and bereavement. And they wrote that it's necessary to consider collective grief that Black Americans have suffered as a result of America's long history of racialization and racial violence. That collective grief continues to be felt today. Wilson said, especially with the high-profile cases of racial violence, such as the murder of George Floyd in 2020, repeatedly making headlines, that personal loss is a domain where the loss is more of an individual experience, like losing a loved one, whereas collective loss is more of an experience that happens communally. Um, the George Floyd murder is a good example. It was a personal loss for his immediate family and friends, but it was also a collective loss in that many Black Americans looked at George Floyd as someone who could be their uncle, could be their brother, or could be them. Collective grief isn't often the primary focus of grief research, but it may be a critical component of the Black grief experience, which has been understudied in psychology. We have a narrow definition of grief that doesn't account for more collective losses. Collective bereavement, along with personal loss, may have this additive effect of creating a unique experience of loss and grief in the Black American community that isn't showed in research so far because of lack of representation of Black Americans in research. And so you can read the rest on your own. And this is from Grief is a direct has a direct impact on racism, from Robert K. Timothy at The Conversation. Roberta, she gives 8 ways to support yourself through dealing with the impact of racism and how this kind of cyclical realities of racism constantly affect Black people's health. She talks about how grief is a direct result of racism and intersectional violence, and it affects us physically, emotionally, financially, spiritually, transnationally, and transgenerationally. More importantly, not being able to fully engage in our grief is a direct outcome of chronic experiences of racist violence. And she talks about this winter, the grandmother of the deceased Colton Bushey told the New York Times, even to this day, I hold back on crying. So insoluble grief, anti-Black racism, and other forms of violence that Black, Indigenous, and racialized people deal with can result in chronic, prolonged traumatic health issues. These issues can include diabetes, high blood pressure, heart attack, cancer, and low birth rates. So this article also talks about how grief that isn't expressed also has negative health impacts on Black people and other oppressed people. Roberta K. Timothy also created her own field of study called anti-oppression psychotherapy, and it's a trauma-informed model that addresses the delusion and confusion of trauma in the bodies and minds of the oppressed. It is a resistance and a revolutionary model that grows out of Black feminist and intersectional theories and practices. It examines the impacts and intersections of oppression as they interact together. It interprets issues of racism as acts of trauma and violence to our health, and it incorporates resistance strategies and healthy coping mechanisms to help community members and clients through grief, loss, and identity formation. This model exists because the erasure of our grief, our loss needs to be known, attended to, cared for, and supported to survive continuous violence battled daily from generation to generation. Self and community care is critical to combating the effects of racism and intersectional violence. AOP addresses racism as a health determinant and gives the power to heal back to the communities who are suffering. So Roberta gave a few examples of healthy coping mechanisms for dealing with racial trauma. So the 8 here are building safe spaces, making an ongoing healing plan, creating alone time to be able to process through that trauma through meditative and relaxation practices, expressing emotions and having a physical release, finding ways to get those emotions out instead of letting them cook and simmer within you. If possible, cooking and eating nutritional food daily, regularly. But as we all know, in certain neighborhoods, there are food deserts, and healthy food isn't always accessible. So again, how health is not just individual; it's also systematic. Another one she mentioned was creating community support and information sharing, making space for transgenerational teachings, and last, supporting local and transnational activism because healing is political. So to end, and I will give you a couple of minutes to think about this. Since this anthology references Toni Morrison's Beloved, I wanted to think about the character Sethi and how Beloved is about her processing through her own pain, trauma, and grief. And I use this quote from the end of the book, in which Paul D told Sethi, Sethi, he says, "Me and you, we got more yesterday than anybody. We need some kind of tomorrow." He leans over and takes her hand. With the other, he touches her face. You, your best thing, Sethi. You are. His holding hands, his holding fingers are holding hers. Me. And I appreciate this scene because it was Paul D offering support to Sethi in the face of her grief and trauma. So, a question I want to leave you with is what kind of tomorrow do you need and what actions can you connect with and to help you transform your pain to help you envision that kind of tomorrow. So I'll give you a couple minutes to think about that and then we'll return to end with resources. Okay, so I hope you were able to at least start a response to the prompt questions and feel free to continue writing on your own. Wanted to end with some resources to help continue thinking about grief work. I mentioned earlier Black Liturgies. They have a great resource on Instagram where they share different reflections on thinking about Black grief and how we heal through Black pain and trauma. Cole Arthur Riley, who is the founder of Black Liturgies, also has a book out called This Here Flesh. That is a great work that you can check out. I mentioned earlier Ancestors in Training. They do a lot of work around ancestral work and grief work and thinking about what kind of ancestor do you want to be to the next generations that are coming after you. Embodied Black Girl is also a great resource in thinking about grief work and embodiment and how do we um, uh, feel pain through our bodies and do grief work through our bodies. Um, Another resource, Transforming Grief from the Institute for Development of Human Arts, provides a lot of resources around grief work. More Black men are seeking help to manage their grief by Constant Brosa is an article looking more about how Black men are thinking about different ways of acknowledging and dealing with their own grief and trauma. A Ritual in Therapy for Prolonged Grief by Joanna Wojcikowiak, Jonah Lind, and Gert E. Smid. That's another article looking at how the different rituals around grief work. Earlier, I mentioned Layla F. Saad, and she does a lot of work around racism and somatics. And of course, also Resma, who does a lot of work around somatic abolitionism as well. So I hope you're able to take these resources and use it to help you in transforming your own pain and honoring your own stories as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sharice. We have 1 minute, and there's so much that I wanted to touch on, but I think one thing that really made me think about this was how pain and grief can be a tool of like systems of oppression and systems of power, right? And how through this pain and grief, they kind of make us um, become docile, right? We're unable to actually do anything because we are living with this pain and grief. Um, and how that can almost become a template for us,
Mm,
that even for grief that's outside of that systemic issue, right?
mhm,
Pain and grief that we have in our own personal lives, we kind of deal with it in that same way of kind of shutting down and just not addressing it, right? And that then leads to poor health outcomes when we think about health behavior, right?
mhm,
We are stuck in that pre-contemplation of like we don't even know that there's a problem
mm,
because we have been told that it's not a problem to feel this way.
mhm.
So really, really powerful. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you at our next Wellness Wednesday. Have a
Yeah.
great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.